Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. Today we are very pleased to have two very high caliber researchers slash at least all former public officer policy maker. So we have Robert Liberty and Lynn Peterson, and Robert is currently the director for Institute for Sustainable Solutions at Portland State University. He's also directing the Urban Sustainability Accelerator. And Lynn is currently a transportation consultant, and she is the former Secretary of Transportation in Washington State, among other public offices, public positions. For today, they will talk about the California's paradigm shift from level service to VMT. With that, I'll give the floor to Lynn.
Thank you. So I'm going to kick off the presentation, and Robert's going to do cleanup. There'll be a lot. Just kidding. Thank you all for coming this morning. I want to just go over kind of the three things we're going to talk about today. First is we're going to go over the major performance transportation metrics, which is one, that we've used in the past and why, and how it's affected the development of transportation projects. Really skim through that quickly because it's kind of the background to why California has moved in starting to move in a slightly different direction and the tensions around that. And then what is Senate Bill 743 that was passed in California, why it passed, and then the research project that we were hired by basically the four major MPOs in California to help them do some research on how to implement Senate Bill 743. So I pulled this off of the CNU website. How many of you are familiar with Congress for New Urbanism? Okay, not very many. You should all be familiar with it by the time you graduate. It's a very good group that is documenting some of the work that's going on around the nation to transform freeways. They mostly talk about how to build complete communities, but they're also looking at how to transform highways. And this picture, I just put it up here as why is this so important to start looking at other performance metrics. This is which is it? It's I-980 in Oakland. And there's a group called Connect Oakland that's looking at how to reimagine this freeway and the land uses around it. And that's really important because how we got to, what is this, a 6-lane freeway with on and off ramps and a lack of connection between one side of the highway as well as these frontage roads was due to the conversation around level of service, right? And you can see the actual land uses here are pretty low density and pretty spread apart. And what they're trying to imagine it into is something that would look more like this in the heart of Oakland, right? So how do you get from building a freeway system right through a downtown back to something that would actually serve the land uses downtown and reimagine the land uses at much higher density for retail, commercial, and office space? So how do we actually do that? A lot of you know some of the major performance measure that is a part of triggering capacity increases in highways, and it's called the level of service standard. How many of you know basically what level of service standard is? All right. So just like you're graded in school, there is a level service A, B, C, D, and F for a highway. And what that basically means is you have a highway capacity to, why am I stumbling over this? The ratio. No, it's the ratio between the demand over the capacity. So if you have a very low demand for that freeway lane or freeway lanes, you're traveling at a very high speed. So they're measuring your delay, right? So they're trying to minimize delay. So a level of service A means that you have very little delay. So on a highway segment, that means that you're basically traveling at 2 in the morning. There's no one in front of you. There's no one in back of you. You can go at the posted speed limit. By the time you get to C, level of service C, you're seeing a little bit of delay. There might be a little bit of hitting the brakes, but you're basically still able to go a pretty decent speed compared to the posted speed limit. By level of service F, what are we doing? You're stopped. In California, what's really important to know is that even 20 years ago, they were talking about things being so bad at level service F for most of the peak period of the travel commute times. They were talking about level service F, F1, F2, F3, and F4. And what that really meant was that they were measuring the time of the peak period of how long things were completely and utterly stopped. Right? So you're basically moving about 20 miles per hour or less. So that's your trigger, right? When you get to level service D, 20 years ago we were talking about level service C and D being our measures of when we would actually need more capacity. If that's your only measure to add capacity or to figure out how to deal with the transportation system, your only solution is to add capacity to get more lanes. And that's what led us to the I-980 example of trying to add more lanes to make sure that our level of service or your delay was not so bad. But pretty soon we figured out that that wasn't working. This is just a speed flow diagram up here at the top. And basically the more, obviously, the more cars you have per lane, the slower you're going to go. Now, do any of you know how we determine capacity on the highway? Okay. So when you were in driving school when you were 16, what did they tell you about your braking distance? How many on the highway? How many seconds did you need to count out to be a safe traveling distance between you and the car in front of you? That's a pretty good measure, but a little high. So we're very conservative. I grew up in Wisconsin. It was your basic perception reaction time is 2.5 seconds. So generally they tell you 3 seconds. So if you see a pole up in front of you, right, a highway sign, if you can measure the 3 seconds, and because I grew up in Wisconsin, it was 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. So if you had that kind of space in front of you, in front of the car, that would be a safe braking distance for you. What about when you're pulling up into an intersection? You remember what that is? And you all don't do it. I can tell you that right now. You're supposed to be 1 car length away from the car in front of you for a safe distance. So if anybody rams into the back of you, you don't ram into the back of the person in front of you, right? So when you get in a car accident, your insurance, you're going to get blamed for hitting the car in front of you, even though you were jammed up by the guy in back of you, right? There's a whole reason for that we do have safe stopping distances, and that speed flow diagram is based on how many cars we can get per lane. And you all don't do 3 seconds, and you all don't do a whole car length, right? So we are trying to, as people, trying to jam more cars in here, but generally on a highway segment it's about 2,200 vehicles per lane per hour. So that was kind of our trigger. We're not going to go into that. But generally what this led us to is this wonderful comic strip that basically says level service was feeding the machine, right? Because it was the only trigger. We had no other measurement of what we should be doing or how we would actually measure accessibility. For instance, which a lot of you I know probably are looking at how to measure accessibility now. We didn't talk about that. And you probably aren't talking about how to move people and freight. We were talking about moving cars, and we were talking about moving cars like they were water through a pipe. So we were just trying to reduce the conflicts. So Senate Bill 743 is kind of a reaction to the level of service, because what do I have here? In the major urban areas, CEQA, which is more tough than the Environmental Protection Act, right? It's the California Environmental Quality Act. And what it has done is said that for all land use development and all transportation development in the state of California, you need to do a CEQA analysis. In other words, you need to know what your impacts are, both to the air and water, but also to the transport network. because there's a greenhouse gas emission issue. And the more cars there are out there, right, the higher greenhouse gas emissions we're going to have. So just like the conversations we're having here in the Portland region right now, the major metropolitan areas we're having as well, if you want more transit-oriented development to reduce the number of car trips or the length of those car trips and build complete communities, and you want to go higher density, right, closer to neighborhoods, the single most used mechanism to stop those high-density developments near transit by the neighborhoods were the CEQA Act. And they based it on the fact that it was going to create more vehicle trips into their neighborhood. Because, right, even if you have high-density development that's near transit, there's still going to be more trips than there were before. And there are certainly going to be more vehicle trips than there were before, even if a higher percentage of them are taking transit. So what they said was, we're going to use a different measurement in order to deal with these problems. And also on the transportation side, we don't want to keep adding capacity and not actually dealing with our congestion issues. We want other modes to be able to move forward as well. So we need to measure this differently. So they said, we're going to use vehicle miles traveled. So it doesn't matter what car you're in. It doesn't matter whether it's electric or whether it's gas or diesel. We want to reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled per person and for the region on average. So what they did is kind of an emergency measure almost. They said, we are going to allow for transit-oriented development to happen. We're going to streamline you through. But only if you're in a transit priority area. And they mapped out these transit priority areas throughout the entire state and every major metropolitan area. So if you think about what that would be, it would be a quarter mile on each side of a frequent bus line, right, because that's the walkable distance, and a half mile from any major high-capacity transit, such as light rail or commuter rail stations. So when you start mapping out all of those in your head, those are the areas that are going to be streamlined through for development that meets the zoning requirements, the maximum density requirements. You don't have to go through an analysis for whether you increase or decrease VMT because you're assumed to do better than the average of the region. For transportation projects and anything that's not meeting those high-density developments or outside of those transit priority areas, you now have to show that you don't have a significant impact on the VMT of the region. So it's another way to measure, and I think the important thing is that what we're finding throughout our work in planning and engineering is that there is no one measure, right? If you measure one thing, you've got a very one-dimensional view of your entire universe. To have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 measures, you start to understand what's actually happening in the system, and you understand what's happening to people, not just in general what's happening to the vehicles on the system. There's a complete and utter shift that we need to make, and this is part of that shift in California. Would you add anything on that transportation yet? Okay. So the research project that we were asked to participate on was, while the regions had been starting to work with some of the consultants and some of the universities down in California on what was the decision-making process, and this is Fair and Peers. They've got this online. It's Navigating Land Use and Navigating Transportation Projects, kind of a decision-making matrix for projects that you might want to get through as a developer or as a jurisdiction with the transportation projects. It's a decision-making matrix. They didn't really have a good handle on how to apply different policies and the methodology. So they said, what we need help on is kind of multifold, but they really wanted, I'm looking for my questions that we wanted to answer. They wanted to look at technical technical revisions. The Office of Planning and Research, which falls under the governor, had provided technical guidance, but that guidance had done things like you would have a defining significant impact if you took the average VMT for a region and divided it by the number of projects within the region. You shouldn't fall below that number. Do you see any problems with that? So let's say you have one giant project and you have 29 small projects in a region. And you have an average VMT, you divide that up, or your total VMT, you divide that by 30 projects. What does that do for your small projects? Does it hurt or help them? It's going to hurt them. Does it hurt or help the large project? Yeah. You have had coffee this morning. Anybody? Yeah, it really isn't fair to a lot of the projects, and it doesn't really get at the issue with the large highway project, which is, was that the right way to go about solving the congestion problem in that area? So they wanted us to look at the benefits of proposed revisions through a process of case studies and testing the methodologies, because there's many different ways to actually measure VMT. There's a lot of regional models that in aggregate measure VMT, and there are a lot of sketch models that do some VMT estimation at a very small scale. So they wanted us to test all that. Then there are a lot of policy questions that start to come up, and we'll talk about those a little bit. But this was one of the conversations that Robert likes to refer to. You can see the tension in the face of the Office of Planning and Research person who was in charge of writing the technical guidance with the director of the LA region. So really a lot of the tension that comes out of this is from the jurisdictions and the developers, do I still get to do my project? Or am I going to have to mitigate something that I never thought I'd have to mitigate, and can I even mitigate it? So that is actually us at the end of each of our meetings that we had. Because of Robert's good facilitation skills, we would go from that picture to that. So thank goodness, right? So we have 2 case studies done, and I thought I would just run through those quickly. The first one, and we're going to do 6 of them, hopefully, depending on time and interest, but the Cannery case study is in Davis, California. It's 100 acres of mixed-use development. It's on the outskirts of Davis, so right at the edge, right? And Davis has a lot of commuting into Sacramento for jobs. It was selected because it was at the edge, because we wanted to test the models and how they reacted to a largish development at the edge. So it's 551 residential dwelling units. 110 of those are affordable. 240,000 square feet of non-residential that will house 600 to 800 jobs. So that's quite a large development at the edge of a very small city, right, which is very university focused. So the issues that were discovered by going through the analysis, the purpose was to compare the original CEQA analysis of old projects, right, not new projects moving forward, because that was too political. So we looked at the CEQA analysis to what the VMT analysis based on the guidance, the technical guidance from the Office of Planning and Research. And not surprisingly, we found out that there were edge issues because models on the whole have like we said, have a hard time trying to analyze what the impact is of trips coming in and out of these cities. It's hard to get a good estimate, and so they're usually pretty. The minute you start forecasting 20 years in the future, they get pretty uncalibrated. What do I want to say? There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise at the edge of the region. And then what we found is that Senate Bill 375, which was their Sustainable Communities Senate bill from 10 years plus prior, had defined transit priority areas one way, and that the Senate Bill 743 defined it a completely different way. So that's going to have to be given more technical guidance by the Office of Planning and Research of how to work out this definitional issue, because all of the community plans were based on the first definition of transit priority areas that got somehow tweaked. So all of their community plans are based on one definition, but yet now working developer to developer, it's going to be a different definition for the VMT analysis. And they probably don't want that going forward. The last one is that while you don't want to standardize VMT analysis, not surprisingly, all the sketch models gave different answers, because each sketch model is actually set up for a certain type of development, and certainly not at the edge. It's becoming very clear that each sketch model, everything will be by context. And that is not normally how we have done things in the past in the United States. We've standardized things to the point where the numbers don't really necessarily make sense, like level of service analysis. We so standardized it that it doesn't make sense for every context. So we're going to have to really be careful going forward that we make sure that the sketch model, we understand the assumptions behind the sketch model match the assumptions that we see on the ground for now and in the future. So let me just take a moment before I go to the next case study and talk about assumptions and why it's so important that you never assume that a standard assumption is still valid for every context that you work in. And I don't care if you're in land use or transportation, it applies to both. So how many of you go the speed advisory curve sign speed when you're driving? You're lying. Really? You do? All right, why?
Because I always try to maintain the same distance between the car and back of me.
Okay.
That if I keep that speed, I generally never need to touch my brake.
Okay. Interesting.
They fluctuate so much that sometimes you get bigger gaps and
Mm-hmm.
go in, but most of the time, yeah, you're a little slower than everyone else, but your speed is steady.
So, but the rest of you find that you're going, what, 5, 6, 7, 8 miles more than the speed advisory curve sign? Yeah, I'm not talking about the posted speed. I'm talking about the curve advisory speed sign. So let's say you're out in the outside of, you're on your way to Mount Hood, and you're on your way to Mount Hood via Estacada, and there's a big sign that says curve ahead, 35 miles an hour. Now you getting it? Okay. Well, no, those are posted speeds, and then there's then we've got the freeway advisory speeds. Yeah, no, these are curve signs. So that's important. It's the curve sign. So how many of you actually go the curve advisory speed? Okay. Oh, you drive a truck. Yeah, okay. So the speed advisory curve signs are based on what's comfortable and what's not comfortable. It's called the ball bank test. And it was developed a very, very long time ago. And technicians on the state or county road system will actually put a little piece of cardboard up on the dash. On that cardboard is a needle hanging down, and underneath that needle it says comfortable range and uncomfortable range. And they literally drive through with a sedan, a state sedan. You can visualize this, right? State sedan, and they drive through once. That was uncomfortable. I was going too fast. They drive through again. That's closer to comfortable, but not there. They drive through again. Oh, that's where we'll set it. That's right at the uncomfortable, comfortable. That's all they know. That's all they know. Comfortable, uncomfortable, too fast, fast, right? Now, they might personally think, well, I would drive faster through that, right? But this is what the test says I'm supposed to sign it at. So they sign it at that speed. Two very, very interested engineers back in 1996, 1997 got published in the ITE Journal of Traffic Engineering. They asked the question, why can I go faster? Well, it turns out that in order to stay on the road, right, that's comfortable, uncomfortable, that's really what we're talking about. It's the friction factor between your car and the road. It was based on a 1947 car. Okay. What's changed since 1947? Thank you. Let's start with the car. What about the cars? We sit lower. Our wheelbase is further apart. Our tires are completely different. That's just, we've got different suspension, right? What about the road itself? What do we... We bank the curve. We have different aggregate so that we can get a higher friction factor because we are worried about your safety. So that asphalt, that concrete, it's been engineered to have a higher friction factor. So if we assume from 1947 on and don't tell people what comfortable and uncomfortable is based on, or don't care, right, we end up pushing these assumptions forward. So that's why context is so important, and that's why challenging assumptions, or even understanding the assumptions and saying, every couple years, whether you're in land use or whether you're in transportation, we can't stay static. Otherwise, we end up overbuilding or we end up underbuilding, right, whether it be buildings or whether it be transportation. So it's just really important that's some of the importance of these case studies is digging down into some of the assumptions and understanding what needs to change in order to get the outcomes we want. And what they wanted was more transit-oriented development, right? And what they wanted was more modes other than just highway. So we have to keep challenging those assumptions. So the last case study, because we've only got 2 done to date, is a highway expansion at the edge of the LA region. So you can see it in the lower left picture, the purple line in the upper right, and then you can see it in the upper right picture there in red. So it basically added a lane in each direction, what they call mixed flow or HOV lane, and it completed a system of HOV. They were also looking to reduce the merge and weave conflicts because the more merge and weave you have, the less capacity you actually have on your highway system. And they wanted to reduce congestion and improve effectiveness of the overall system. Interestingly enough, it's operating today at level of service D. And in the future, it would operate at level of service F. But you can see it's on the edge of the region, right? So it's a hard place to do analysis again. Today, the land uses our residential densities are moderate. There's open space, a lot of open space because they're at the edge, and a lot of public facilities. So what we've looked at to date is the impact area definition. We'll talk about that quick, and the VMT estimation. What we still have to look at is what is a significant impact? How does that definition, how different people want to define significant, and then how to mitigate it if it isn't meeting the purpose and need. The findings to date on this one, again, probably not too surprising, but start to get at the underlying assumptions. The impact area for a VMT, vehicle miles traveled, is much greater than for a CEQA analysis when you're just looking at level of service. And why would that be? Because when you start to look at vehicle miles traveled, you're looking at who's coming from where in the entire region. Right? When you're looking at level of service, you're just doing the analysis along the corridor. When you're doing greenhouse gas emissions, you have to do some vehicle miles traveled estimation, and they did that. But because they drew the study area so tight, just like with the Columbia River crossing, remember we drew it right around the bridge, so it was very hard to get at a lot of what other people wanted to talk about because it was outside the study area. So that's true with this project as well, is that when you draw the impact areas being tight, you don't pick up on all of the induced travel that will result from the capacity increase, right? So that induced travel being what other trips are now going to be on this system or what other growth is going to happen near this road. So we found that they had drawn that very tightly and they hadn't picked up on all of the VMT-induced impacts. And the existing ENIR, the existing CEQA analysis did not include estimates of VMT except for the CEQA, and that regularly occurs. But I think what we also wanted to point out is that the level of service analysis in a travel demand model is just as in a large regional model doesn't necessarily have a good level of, what am I trying to say? It's not, there's a lot of noise, again, in the model. Because you're doing it at a regional level. So if you're doing a level of service analysis or you're doing a VMT estimate, there's a big range of numbers. You can't just take one number and say it's going to be X, right? We always want to do that, but we really can't. And so it doesn't matter what measure you're using when you're using a regional model. You have to understand that there's a broad range of answers here. Because there's a broad range of unknowns, right? Those assumptions for the future. Currently, there's no analogy for a VMT threshold standard that is comparable to the level of a level of service. Like I said, level of service A, B, C, D. So our approach to fill this void is still under development, but it'll likely be quantitative, but somewhat contextual, like we talked about before, depending on where you are at and what kind of model you're using. And then there's a well-developed literature on the impacts of policies and strategies to reduce VMT, to mitigate it, because that's the last part of this that everybody's very worried about, is how to mitigate it. If you do add capacity in a highway corridor, how do you mitigate it? And really, the biggest question that has come out of the discussions is, if you're the regional government and you're modeling VMT, and you have to mitigate it in order to get the project through, that means you have to assume that a whole bunch of other things are happening, such as land uses are moving to different places so you can shorten the vehicle miles traveled, right, of people getting to their job or whatever. So you have to move land uses. You can add capacity with transit, right, which would reduce your vehicle miles traveled. You can do a lot of other things, but none of that is under the control of the agency who's doing the analysis. So how do you know it's actually going to get done? How do you know it's actually going to be mitigated? That's the same issue that we have with level service, but it's still a very valid question of how do you actually do that. So final comments, and then I'll turn it over to Robert. Is that we've made progress to date by having this dialogue between all these groups to try and work through some of the issues. The foundation funding from Transit Center in New York City was foundational to being able to do this, because basically we were brought in as the third party who had no project, no dog in the fight, right, to be able to work through these things. The case studies may offer proof of concept for methods to comply with the new law, but the findings will include a lot more questions, both legal and technical. And they may not answer all the questions, but at least we got them talking. And I think the most fascinating part of it for me is that we're moving into a whole new era of how to talk about transportation and land use projects, how to measure their benefits and costs. And what is keeping people from moving forward is the fact that not everything is perfect. Right? Because we've been using the same measures for 70 years, so we know how to use them for advantage to our project or disadvantage our project. And the scary part is that nobody knows right now how to basically game the system. And so that's kind of the conversation that we're wading through right now is, how do I know I have the data? How do I know I'm using the methodologies correctly? And how do I know that I'm not going to end up in court over my project? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert. Oh.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the 6 Ps, which are paradigm shift, pollution, politics, planning, permitting, and prediction. So the paradigm shift that Lynn has referred to, really this is very significant. So for 60 years, the approach has been the most important thing about transportation planning is the speed of the trip and the travel. Not actually, by the way, not the length of the trip, but how fast you're going on your trip. So we have a standard that says if your land uses are 60 miles away, but you're going 60 miles an hour, it's great. But if you only take 15 minutes, you know, going 20 miles an hour, that's not as good, because if you're doing that slowly. That's really what we're talking about, is speed is more important than anything else, and that's the only thing we measure. And to change to that and say, the good we're trying to maximize is not the speed of your car, but we're trying to minimize how much driving you're doing. That is a dramatic. That's really turning the whole system on its head. So that is a very fundamental change in a state that is the symbol of seen as car culture. I actually don't believe there is such a thing as car culture. I think we build a system that requires you to drive. But California was the emblem of an American pattern of development transportation. Level of service was a key tool in perpetrating that system. So we only had one measure, that was speed, nothing about anything else we're trying to accomplish, and no recognition that the transportation investments focused on speed of personal automobile travel had a big effect on land use. So that is people use the phrase paradigm shift too much. This is a paradigm shift. Second thing, pollution. Where did this law come from? It came from California's extremely ambitious goals to reduce greenhouse gases, the gases that are changing the climate around the world. And they went through a very elaborate, the California Air Resources Board and all their supporting institutions, a very elaborate sectoral analysis about how do we reduce greenhouse gases. And it's all of them, by the way, not just carbon dioxide and other tailpipe emissions, nitrous oxides and so on, but all of them. And they said, well, we've got an energy sector, we have agriculture and so on, and then we have an automobile fleet. But the fleet is changing. We're going to have more hybrids, more efficient automobiles, and electric automobiles. But when that was all done, there was still a gap to meet the goals, and that gap had to be filled by changing land use patterns to be more compact, to allow people to walk and drive and use transit. And you have to have a minimum level of density, as you all know, in order to support a transit system. You can't run light rail out to 5-acre home sites. It's impossible financially. So that remaining responsibility for greenhouse gases was assigned to changing land use patterns through this legislation. So that's the connection with pollution. But the other thing that's interesting about it is, in order to reduce greenhouse gases and promote compact development, which has been state policy in California at least since Senate Bill 375, but really before, to stop sprawling, grow more compactly, more mixture of uses, they had to reform an existing law called the California Environmental Quality Act. Think about that. So the obstacle to achieving greenhouse gas reduction, stopping sprawl, was the California Environmental Quality Act. Now, the irony of this is well known in California. Everyone understands this. There was a story, I don't know if it's true or not, that the California Environmental Quality Act litigation involving San Francisco's proposed bike lanes cost more than the bike lanes. So there's a fair amount of documentation on this. It's highly partisan, of course. So that leads me then to some discussion of the politics. So Lynn's already described this. Who supports it? Who opposes it? Well, of course, environmental groups, people concerned about greenhouse gas reduction, support this. The parts of California that are already making a transition away from large increases in roadways and freeway capacity, Northern California, actually parts of Southern California, accept this. I wouldn't say they're thrilled about it, but they accept it. And that leaves a portion of Southern California that is vehemently opposed. Who is that? Those are people whose own paradigm for land development and transportation is dependent on adding capacity to roadways. So the idea was that this standard, it's taken on ideological cast, which is, this is a symbol of the country we want, have known, which is it's car-oriented, private automobiles, low-density development, single-family homes, separate from commercial uses, retail, and civic uses. That's a lot of what America was built on, and there are people who make money, whose livelihoods, whose professional services are dependent on that. This is a challenge to all of that. So there are very powerful people who are strongly opposed to this, and they've called it the war on the car. So again, these are culture references, which is the war on a way of life, a way of thinking, which in some ways is really, it provides an ideological gloss to cover the fact that the existing system doesn't really work. It's not like this is working, right? We didn't solve congestion. There's enough money to build everything to get us to level service C, let alone A. So But that is the politics, and so people are very fearful. And part of what we hope the project does is to alleviate the fear. So I should say that the other part of the politics is the regions, so San Francisco Bay Area, Sacramento, and actually the city and county of Los Angeles have accepted this and embraced it. Why? Well, politically they're more concerned about things like air pollution, greenhouse gas. They're more willing to accept the idea of a different development pattern. They're bluer rather than redder in their politics. But the other part of it is the amount of money that's available for road capacity is shrinking nationally, but in those places it's really shrunk a lot. So the idea is that, well, if we have this standard, then we'll show this congestion, then we get money to build the freeways. Well, when you get to that last stage, there isn't any money. So people want to think about, well, what do we do to get more value out of what we're doing, and that is to reduce the amount of driving. And that is through different interventions, including pricing, things that are heading demand management, and, of course, more mixed-use development, more transit. I want to talk about what I think may happen and how this project may intersect with it. There are very powerful forces that are coming after this law and its implementation. Their primary focus is to remove big transportation projects from this analysis. So when the SR 210 case study is done, we'll end up with a pretty big number that under California law, to simplify it, if you're generating 1 million extra VMT or 500,000 a day, you have to reduce that somewhere. Well, people don't know how to do that. We hope our project will have a workshop that will help people understand what you could do. Maybe Pasadena adopts a new parking charges all over, or another part of the region implements dynamic tolling, pricing, and that's enough to reduce the VMT to offset another project. I don't know, that's pretty challenging, but at least in concept it makes sense. Whether the law will survive intact, I don't know. I think it's not clear. The other source of friction is the technical difficulties that staff face, which they communicate to elected officials. So if they're tearing their hair out because they're having a hard time understanding how to do this and expensive and takes time, they tell their bosses that. And the bosses, many of whom are skeptical about government anyway, say, what I'm hearing from my staff is this doesn't work. And it's driving us crazy, and so we oppose it. So that's another way I think we can be helpful in this project, to at least make it a little clearer and a little easier to do. Now, relevance to our region and Oregon. Oh, one other thing I want to mention is there's a lot of other reasons to reduce driving rather than to facilitate high-speed travel. So higher speeds correlate with more deaths. So we're actually talking about killing more people. It's correlated with more pollution, which is not just changing the climate, but there's direct impacts on health. We now can measure and quantify them. It's also connected to a land development system that destroys a lot of resources and itself causes both climate change and other environmental impacts. And it's also too expensive to do this now, so it's really beyond our means. It was very interesting to me in another project I did through the Urban Sustainability Accelerator, which is to talk about congestion in the Lake Tahoe region, which is not an urban area, so it doesn't get the benefit of programs focused on urban congestion. And at the end of the day, this facilitation, the entire conversation was on efficiency. Nothing about adding roads. Zero. People had given up on that. It was very interesting. Everything talked about information systems, pricing, changing land development patterns the entire day. And I think that's where we are headed as a nation anyway. Then the thing that has struck me continuously, and I think my colleagues Lynn and Sam from Oregon, is the difference between a permitting approach to decisions about land use and transportation and a planning approach. So the California Environmental Quality Act resembles other state environmental policy acts, which are to do a case-by-case analysis of every project and weigh the outcome. But we know that is a very hard thing to do when you're talking about thousands of decisions and over a very big landscape over a long period. And it's very hard to connect this decision to a large outcome. Like we build one shopping center here, the impacts are not significant. But if it's part of a system, we can see the impacts over the long term, over the landscape. And Oregon chose in the 70s not to adopt a state environmental policy act. Many people outside Oregon are shocked when they hear that. They see Oregon as an environmental leader. You don't have a state environmental policy act. No. What we have is a planning program. The planning program does the same thing, except it's in the aggregate long term. What about thousands of decisions on houses, thousands of decisions on apartments, on shopping centers, and so on? Put them all together and say, these are the outcomes we want to implement. And the transportation, we don't do this perfectly, is supposed to facilitate that. So the goal is not speed of movement, but creating a transportation network that supports a vision around a development pattern that embodies a set of values, and not just environmental values, but social values as well. And those are radically different approaches. Now, one of the things that people in California are obsessed about is litigation over CEQA. I mean, it determines, even conversations we have, people will say, I'm not going to put that in writing, because they don't want that to be seen as an interpretation of CEQA that might bind a government or affect my client. So people are obsessed about this. Do we have litigation around land use in Oregon? Absolutely. I ran an organization that did a lot of it. But when Thousand Friends of Oregon litigates an urban growth boundary adjustment at Metro, it's litigating one decision that's going to have an effect for 20 years with thousands of individual decisions all at once. It's one case, not 1,000 cases. So these are completely different. And what I hope happens out of this is things like discussing, well, if we're going to reduce driving, we can't do it at project level. We have to think about big scale things like pricing or change the land development patterns. Well, that's a planning effort. It's not a project effort, it's a planning effort. So that this could lead to a greater thinking about a planning approach and not a project approach. That would be a great outcome. I'm going to end on the production part now. And by the way, you may know this, but we use level of service a lot in Oregon. If you look at Washington County, the county to the west of here with 500,000 people growing fast, that is not the only indicator, but a very important indicator in a way they target their money. What level of service are we headed? Then we have to add capacity. So this debate is going to happen in Oregon, and I've already seen foreshadowing of that, both at the state and the regional level. But on a completely different note, I'm wondering whether or not all of this will seem irrelevant in a few years. Why? Well, this was in Automotive Age, the voice of the automobile industry from this month, a commentary written by Bob Lutz, former vice chairman and head of product development at General Motors, senior executive positions with Ford, Chrysler, BMW, and Opel. It saddens me to say it, but we are approaching the end of the automotive era. The auto industry is on an accelerating change curve. For hundreds of years, the horse was the prime mover of humans. For the past 120 years, it has been the automobile. Now we're approaching the end of the line for the automobile because travel will be in standardized modules. The end state will be the fully autonomous module with no capability for the driver to exercise command. You will call for it. We'll arrive at your location. You'll get in, input your destination, go to the freeway. The freeway will go 120 to 150 miles an hour. You'll have a blending of rail type with individual transportation. As you approach your exit, your module will enter deceleration lanes. Go to your final destination. It will be billed for the transportation. You'll enter your credit card number or your thumbprint, and the module will take off. And these modules will be owned by fleets. And the modules will be ordered by the fleet operators. So that is one view of the future. It's not the only view. But I would say there is a much higher level of uncertainty now about transportation services and how they will be operated. And I know this is already affecting decisions, certainly in California, but elsewhere. For example, car garages are being redesigned not to be ramps so they can be converted to other uses. So this is a big issue. I'm sure there will be a transportation seminar. I wouldn't say that Mr. Lutz is necessarily correct. I would say that the application of technology, both for the vehicle and social technology around paying for transportation services, rethinking what we want and can afford, is leading to a lot of uncertainty. So I think our project's going to be worthwhile in the near term. In the long term, who knows? Thank you. Any good questions?
So it sounds like projects, generally speaking, are kind of assigned like a VMT impact, right, to kind of determine where they go with planning and development, right? Yeah. That's what pulls it. Is there is there like a duration modifier or anything like that for like the, I guess, you know, so you have a VMT impact, right? You have a construction project that's probably going to have, you know, hundreds of people going to it every day. And maybe it impacts like a school or a hospital or something nearby. Is that part of like the equation to kind of determine?
This actually goes back to, I just presented this week? Is that this week?
Traveling a lot.
In Sacramento, and the person who was on the panel with me from one of the consultants who's having to work and try and implement this brought up construction, and you know, what if you've got a tunnel project and you've got 300 trucks a day, whatever it is, right? How are you going to measure that? As far as I understand right now, that is actually not part of it. The construction, I've never heard of the construction of a project being included in the environmental impact statement unless the agency has a sustainable-minded entry into this conversation, and then you're talking about how many of the trucks will be natural gas, what time of day, all of, right? I mean, but yeah. But there are studies. There are a lot of studies that look at the impacts of air emissions during construction that you never achieve the result. You never get a net benefit from the project. So you might reduce congestion on the highway after the project is done, but due to the construction impacts are higher than the benefits.
Are you talking about the delay part or the other environmental
No,
impact?
it's the air pollution.
Well, this is another point, the sore point for me is construction is a major cause of delay nationally.
Right.
Those are never netted out when you're talking about the benefits afterwards.
That's what I was just saying.
Oh, I thought you were talking about construction impacts like air pollution or...
No, it's the congestion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that what
Of
you
the
were after?
construction. But it's not.
Yeah, it sounds like it's an ongoing conversation,
It,
really.
it could be that it gets litigated at some point and either gets included or not. Either way, if somebody includes it and says, I don't want this in here,
I think the idea of net benefits rarely exists in transportation investments. And first of all, the whole discussion of benefits, if you draw a project area a certain way, you're only going to consider the benefits and the disbenefits at all in that area. And the question about who's contributing to it is never seen as an equity issue. So let's give an example, the Columbia River Crossing. The benefits were described in the reduction in potential delay for people traveling from Battleground to downtown Portland. Right? Okay? That's a very small segment, right? And the people paying for it are federal taxpayers, state taxpayers, right? Some of whom are not going to get anything out of it. It's a very expensive project. By the way, the transit benefit was also very low, in my opinion. If you had a bigger project area and a broader definition of benefits, you probably would have come with a completely different project to begin with. That wouldn't be what comes to mind, I think.
Yeah, the original impact area that was drawn up to start the conversation was actually all the way down I-5 over to I-84 and up to 205 and back over SR-14, right?
Yeah.
14 is the connector there.
Or the highway, yeah.
Yeah. So that was actually, and I would say it was even greater than that. I mean, sitting as the chair of Clackamas County during this conversation, with a 6% shift from I-5 to I-205, it would have shut down I-205, right? So how does, you know, it had a bigger impact. And if we had been looking at VMT and not a point level of service on that one segment of that highway, we would have had a different conversation. And I think you would have had a slightly different result, but I also, there was a lot going on there.
I think if you had, by the way, if you'd taken all the benefits, even if it's so narrowly conceived, and say, we're going to do this amount of travel time for this amount of number of people, make that a number and say, okay, that costs $3.6 billion. How much could we reduce, if all we care about is travel time, right, or change it to X or whatever, what can we do with $3.6 billion and compare it to that? You would have had a very different set of projects. I'm sorry, Li Ming, you're...
So, who decides the scope? And that's a two-part question of who decides the scope of a project now and who should be deciding the scope of a project of any
the area you should analyze.
But the lead, in California, the term is lead agency. And how they end up being a lead agency is, is not precise. I think there's not a structure for that. It's who shows initiative, wants to do it, and can fund it. And they define the project area. But Lynn should defer to Lynn as former Secretary of Transportation. How is it done in Washington? How is it done in Oregon?
It's essentially the lead agency. So if you own the asset and you're the plan, I mean, TriMet and Metro have a different relationship. If you own a transportation asset, normally you're the lead on that project. So if you're a county, you're doing the county. If you're a county road, if you're the state, you're doing the state project. Even if somebody else is funding it, like a county, Washington County has paid for 26 improvements, Highway 26 improvements, ODOT would still be the lead agency, so they would define the scope.
The other thing I think people know is if you look at purpose and need statements, which is a starting point for analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, they are so generic. People joke about this, like reduce congestion, increase safety, promote economic development. Right? That doesn't lead to any conclusion about anything. It's just, but then the next level, I remember this with the replacement bridge for the Selwood Bridge, is the next level about how you define is often really indicating what the outcome will be. So really when you get to that point and people endorse it, people already have in mind, well, the only thing that will fit that is this facility.
Well, what was great about breaking from the trend is the 124th project. It became the 124th. It was the last leg of the West Side Bypass coming off of I-205 and going north through Washington County. The reason for that project was to basically move freight. And we actually went from the purpose and need statement into specific outcomes that we wanted with metrics. And it led to not a new highway, but rather an arterial to serve the actual industrial land uses that were generating the freight traffic to get to an interchange that actually had the capacity in Wilsonville. So it's the 124th project resulted. So it's an arterial project for freight, not a highway project. So it did result in meeting the outcomes, right, that everybody had agreed on with real true metrics. There are examples of good projects out there where this was done and you didn't end up with what you thought going in. Right.
Probably follow Travis' question. In a sense, if you think about VMT as a measure, is that it usually only applied very short term, kind of when you add capacity. Generally, they will soon, next day after it's open, it will actually improve the level of service. That's their assumption. And then they're not looking at the induced demand down the road that 1 year, 10 year, 20 years down the road, that those roads will be, the level of service will going back or probably even worse than the starting point, right? So you're talking about kind of the funding of going through that. It's probably not well spent, for example. But kind of similarly, I'm not sure whether the VMT, in terms of, are you looking at the VMT for one property, one project alone, or are you looking at the region? Or are you looking at a very short term, for example, right after the opening of the project?
So technically, where they've started, let's just talk about where they've started, whether it's right or wrong or whether it's going to work or not, they don't know, right? But the significance of an impact measured by the amount of VMT generated from the project compared against whether it's 15% above the average of the region.
Below
the average of the region.
But there's two other response to your question about this term. People know I don't like this term, induced demand. There's existing demand, and when you add capacity, people are not familiar with this concept. There's been a big debate. Well, if you double the road width, you ought to cut the traffic in half. But that doesn't happen. Why? Well, because the time it takes to get to places is reduced, so the same people make more trips, right? And then you get a land development, because now it's easier to get to a job. So this land development occurs. So this has been going on, discussion and then research, for 20 years. So I think in our project, two parts about this. One is there's a literature on it, and it says between, I don't know, 40 and 60% roughly of the capacity gets used up by new trips, including trips that come off arterials and get onto a highway. So right off the bat, your assumption was that if you doubled the freeway lanes, you'd cut the traffic in half. It's like half that doesn't exist because there's more trips. So then your starting point is wrong. That is supposed to be, in California, the Office of Planning Research says, Policy and Research says, that is supposed to be standard in all your analysis. It has nothing to do with legislation. Well, it's a big deal because people don't do that. So that's the first thing. I think the second point about VMT standard, how it's done, is everything is done in this legal framework that's highly elaborated. So a logical answer may not be the correct answer. So we actually have a team of lawyers who are now advising us what is the actual question we have to answer under the law, as opposed to what is a logical thing to think about in terms of VMT reduction.
Well, let's just go back to the induced travel. And have you read Anthony Downs' Stuck in Traffic? If you haven't, you should. It clearly lays out some of the concepts that Robert was just talking about, and it's called the Anthony Downs triple convergence theory. So when you add capacity to a transportation project, and it does not, with a transportation project, and it literally doesn't matter if it's a light rail or a bus or a road, you're going to change the time of day that people were leaving and making their trip, right? Because when they see the added capacity, now they're not going to leave so early. Now they're going to leave right in the middle of the peak area where they get more time at home with their family. It's all good for them until things start to jam up again, right? So they change the time of day that they make their trip. They change the route that they were making their trip. So if they were on the bus, now they're on the light rail. If they were on the light rail and you add capacity to the highway, then they're on the highway, right? So and that's a mode shift. That's the mode shift. So they change the time of day, the route that they were taking, and the mode that they were taking. So you're moving people by time of day, by geographic, and by mode. The minute you add capacity, and it gets filled up, not within the 20 years that we say, but usually within 5. And there's a lot of game theory that's going on with each of those individual decisions, and we don't account for that game theory. And now that we have Google and Waze, that game theory is on steroids. There is no way that any traffic engineer can make any kind of realistic prediction for more than a year or two, and then you think about the issues of the assumptions you have to make to get to 20. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, is we don't know anymore. We are in a very large transition in transportation because there's now money to be made in transportation, way more than just construction, and it's in data, and it's in autonomous vehicles, right? This is now a different industry than the one that we all grew up on in the past. It's going to completely and utterly change, and so making predictions past that 1 to 2 year period is really, really, really difficult. So exciting times for you.
Yeah.
Lynn, for a great
Thank you.
By the way, I can stick around. Maybe Lynn can stick around a few minutes for people to get their questions answered.
We'll now have next week, and the week after we'll have Dr. Chris Cherry to talk about new data for measuring bike behavior and safety.